Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote hollows of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1948 brought an unusually harsh chill to the mountains of Boone County, West Virginia. The leaves had turned early that year, painting the steep ridges in deep crimsons and golds that seemed to bleed into the perpetual mist hanging between the peaks. It was in this season that Jasper and Imogene Whitmore, newlyweds from Charleston, made what would become their final documented journey into the remote hollow known as Ashworth Gap. According to county records preserved in the courthouse basement, the couple had responded to a small advertisement placed in the Charleston Daily Mail on October 3, 1948. The ad, printed in the classified section between offers for used farm equipment and household remedies, read simply, "Clean room for rent, mountain air, quiet surroundings, meals provided, right to see Ashworth, Rural Route 4, Ashworth Gap, Boone County." What drew them to such an isolated location remains unclear, though a letter found decades later in Imogene's jewelry box suggests they were seeking refuge from some unnamed trouble in Charleston. Jasper Whitmore, 26 years old, worked as a clerk at the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway offices. He was described by his supervisor, Barnabas Hendricks, as a reliable employee who rarely missed work and kept to himself. Imogene, 22, had been a seamstress at Morton's department store before their marriage in August of that same year. Their wedding announcement in the Charleston paper mentioned no family in attendance, listing only the bride and groom with no parents, siblings, or relatives noted, an unusual detail that would later capture the attention of investigators. The journey from Charleston to Ashworth Gap required 2 full days of travel in 1948. The couple would have taken the morning train to Beckley, then caught the afternoon bus to Madison, where they would have had to arrange private transportation for the final 30 miles into the mountains. The last documented sighting of the Whitmores was at Garrett's General Store in Madison on October 15th, where store owner Lucinda Garrett sold them supplies including canned goods, lamp oil, and a heavy wool blanket. She later recalled that Imogene seemed nervous and kept glancing toward the mountains, while Jasper appeared determined but unusually quiet. Cordelia Ashworth lived alone in a 2-story frame house built by her late husband's grandfather sometime in the 1870s. The property sat at the head of a narrow valley, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during heavy rains. Cornelius Ashworth, Cordelia's husband, had died in the winter of 1945 from what the local doctor termed pneumonia complications, though no death certificate was ever filed with the county. The nearest neighbors, the Pemberton family, lived 3 miles down the hollow, far enough that smoke from Cordelia's chimney could barely be seen through the trees. The house itself was typical of Appalachian construction from that era, 2 stories with a central chimney, a wide front porch, and an addition built onto the back that served as a kitchen. What made the property unusual was its isolation and the fact that Cordelia had maintained it entirely alone for 3 years following her husband's death. At 58 years old, she was known to walk the 12 miles to Madison twice a month for supplies, never accepting offers of rides from passing motorists, and never explaining how she managed the journey with such regularity despite her age and the difficult terrain. Local records indicate that Cordelia began advertising for boarders in September of 1948, approximately 1 month before the Whitmores responded to her ad. The Pemberton family, when interviewed in 1964, recalled seeing lamplight in the upper windows of the Ashworth house during that period, even though Cordelia had lived alone for years and had previously used only the ground floor rooms. Ambrose Pemberton, the family patriarch, mentioned that his wife Isadora had observed smoke coming from the house's chimney at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, and on several occasions had seen a figure moving about the upstairs rooms with a lantern. The Whitmores arrived at Cordelia's house on the evening of October 15, 1948. How they made the final journey from Madison remains unknown, as no local driver admitted to transporting them and their luggage. 2 leather suitcases and a trunk would have been too heavy to carry the distance on foot. This detail puzzled investigators when the case was reopened 16 years later, as the road to the Ashworth property showed no evidence of recent vehicle traffic when examined by authorities in November of 1948. Cordelia's arrangement with boarders was simple, according to a handwritten contract found among her possessions years later. Renters would pay $15 per month for the upstairs bedroom, with meals provided twice daily and laundry service included. The contract specified that guests were expected to keep regular hours, with the house locked at sunset and no visitors permitted after dark. Most notably, the agreement included a clause stating that boarders were not to enter the basement or the small room behind the kitchen pantry. Areas that Cordelia maintained were for storage of her late husband's personal effects. The bedroom rented to the Whitmores occupied the entire second floor, accessed by a steep staircase that creaked with each step. The room contained a double bed with a straw mattress, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a wardrobe built into one wall. 2 windows provided views of the hollow, one facing down the valley toward the road, the other looking up toward the ridge where the forest grew thick and dark. The windows were fitted with heavy wooden shutters that Cordelia insisted remain closed after dark, explaining that mountain nights could be cruel and the shutters kept the warmth inside. For the first 2 weeks of their stay, the arrangement appeared to function normally. Cordelia maintained a precise routine, serving breakfast at sunrise and supper at sunset. She rarely spoke to her boarders beyond necessary pleasantries, and they seemed content with the quiet solitude. The Pemberton family reported seeing lamplight in the upstairs windows each evening until approximately 9 o'clock, when the house would go dark. Occasionally, they observed the Whitmores walking together down the hollow road in the afternoons, but they never ventured beyond the main path and always returned before dusk. On November 1st, 1948, Isadora Pemberton noticed something unusual. The upstairs windows of the Ashworth house showed no light that evening, nor the evening after. By November 4th, when no lamplight had appeared for 3 consecutive nights, Ambrose Pemberton decided to investigate. He walked the 3 miles up the hollow road and found Cordelia working in her garden, pulling up the last of the season's potatoes. When he inquired about her boarders, Cordelia explained that the young couple had decided to return to Charleston earlier than planned. They had left on November 1st, she said, taking the morning bus from Madison. This explanation satisfied Ambrose at the time, though he later admitted to investigators that something about Cordelia's manner had seemed different. She spoke more rapidly than usual and avoided looking directly at him while she explained the couple's departure. Most notably, she continued working with her hands in the soil while they talked, never pausing to face him or show the courtesy typically expected in mountain culture. When he asked if the couple had found other transportation, she replied that they had made their own arrangements and had specifically requested privacy during their departure. A week later, Lucinda Garrett received a letter postmarked from Charleston and signed J. Whitmore. The letter thanked her for the supplies and mentioned that the mountain air had provided exactly the peace they had sought. However, several details in the letter struck Garrett as odd. The handwriting appeared different from the signature Jasper had written in her store ledger, and the letter mentioned purchasing items that they had not actually bought. When she mentioned this to other residents of Madison, most dismissed her concerns as the result of an aging memory. But she preserved the letter and would later provide it to investigators. Winter arrived early in Boone County that year, with the first significant snowfall occurring in mid-November. By December, the road to Ashworth Gap had become impassable to all but foot traffic, effectively cutting Cordelia off from the outside world until spring thaw. The Pemberton family reported seeing smoke from her chimney throughout the winter months, indicating she had adequate fuel and food stores, but no one attempted the dangerous journey to check on her welfare during the worst of the weather. In March of 1949, when the roads cleared enough for travel, Ambrose Pemberton made his seasonal visit to check on his isolated neighbor. He found Cordelia in good health and spirits, though she seemed to have aged considerably during the winter months. Her hair had gone completely white, and she had lost enough weight that her clothes hung loosely on her frame. When he asked about her winter, she replied that it had been peaceful, and that she had enjoyed the solitude. She mentioned having spent considerable time organizing her late husband's possessions, and had made significant progress in clearing out rooms that had remained untouched since his death. More notably, Cordelia announced that she had decided to discontinue taking in boarders. She explained that the arrangement with the young couple from Charleston had convinced her that she preferred living alone. When Ambrose asked if she needed assistance with income, she assured him that she had adequate resources and would manage well enough on her own. She also mentioned that she had made some improvements to the house during the winter, including renovating the upstairs bedroom and adding storage space in the basement. The spring and summer of 1949 passed without incident. Cordelia maintained her routine of walking to Madison for supplies, though residents noted that she had become even more withdrawn than before. She spoke little during her visits to town, conducting her business efficiently and departing quickly. Several people commented that she seemed to have developed a nervous habit of glancing over her shoulder while walking, as if expecting to be followed. When spoken to directly, she would respond appropriately, but without the warmth that had previously characterized her interactions with neighbors. In September of 1949, Jasper Whitmore's supervisor at the railway office filed a missing person report with Charleston police. Jasper had failed to report for work following his vacation in October of 1948 and had not collected his final paycheck. The railroad's attempts to contact him at his last known address had failed, as the landlord reported that neither Jasper nor his wife had returned to their apartment. Their possessions remained in the rented room, rent unpaid since October. A perfunctory investigation found no evidence of foul play, and the case was closed after 3 months when no new information emerged. The investigation into the Whitmores' disappearance might have ended there, filed away among the hundreds of missing person cases that accumulated in small-town police departments throughout the region. However, in the spring of 1950, a traveling salesman named Mordecai Finch made an observation that would eventually reopen questions about what had occurred at the Ashworth property. Finch sold household goods and patent medicines throughout the remote areas of Boone County, making regular circuits that brought him through Madison 4 times yearly. On his May 1950 visit, he inquired about potential customers in the outlying areas and was directed toward Ashworth Gap. When he mentioned his intention to call on Cordelia Ashworth, Lucinda Garrett warned him that the woman had become increasingly peculiar and might not welcome solicitors. Nevertheless, Finch decided to attempt the journey, as isolated homesteads often provided his best sales opportunities. The road to Ashworth Gap had deteriorated significantly during the harsh winter, requiring Finch to abandon his wagon at the bottom of the hollow and proceed on foot with his sample case. When he reached the Ashworth property, he found Cordelia working in her garden and introduced himself politely. She listened to his sales pitch with apparent interest and invited him to display his wares on her front porch. As he arranged his merchandise, Finch noticed several items that seemed out of place for a woman living alone. Hanging on the porch to dry were men's work clothes, including overalls and flannel shirts that appeared too large for Cordelia's slight frame. When he inquired about them, she explained that they had belonged to her late husband and that she occasionally washed them to prevent moth damage. This explanation struck Finch as unusual, as the clothes appeared to be in regular use rather than stored garments. He also observed women's clothing on the line that seemed too fashionable and too small for Cordelia's current appearance. More significantly, Finch noticed that the upstairs windows had been fitted with new shutters that appeared much sturdier than those typically used in the region. These shutters were constructed of thick oak boards and were secured with heavy iron latches that could only be operated from the outside. When he commented on their craftsmanship, Cordelia explained that she had installed them during the winter to provide better insulation against the cold. She added that the upstairs room required special protection because she stored important documents and family heirlooms there. Finch conducted his business and departed without purchasing anything from him, but the encounter left him with lasting impressions that he later reported to authorities. He noted that Cordelia seemed constantly alert to sounds from inside the house, frequently pausing their conversation to listen intently. At one point, he thought he heard movement from the upper floor, but when he mentioned it, Cordelia dismissed the sound as settling timbers common in old houses. Most memorably, when a board creaked loudly overhead, Cordelia's entire demeanor changed, becoming agitated and insisting that Finch conclude his business quickly, as she had other matters to attend to. During the summer of 1950, the Pemberton family began to notice other changes in their neighbors' behavior. Cordelia's twice-monthly trips to Madison became more irregular, sometimes separated by 6 weeks or more. When she did appear in town, she purchased larger quantities of supplies than a single person would typically need, including multiple bags of flour and rice, several bottles of lamp oil, and unusually large amounts of canned goods. She also began buying men's clothing at Garrett's store, claiming that she planned to donate the items to charity, though no local church reported receiving such donations. More disturbing were the sounds that the Pemberton family began to hear during still nights when the wind was calm. Occasionally, they detected what seemed to be voices carried on the air from the direction of Cordelia's property. The voices were too distant to understand, but they occurred at unusual hours, sometimes well after midnight. Ambrose Pemberton mentioned these observations to other residents of the Hollow, but most dismissed them as the natural sounds of the forest, amplified by the mountain acoustics that could make distant noises seem deceptively close. In October of 1950, exactly 2 years after the Whitmores' arrival at the Ashworth property, a series of events began that would ultimately lead to the discovery of what had occurred during that autumn of 1948. A logging crew working in the ridge above Ashworth Gap reported finding personal items scattered in a ravine approximately 2 miles from Cordelia's house. The items included a woman's leather purse containing identification documents for Imogene Whitmore, a man's pocket watch engraved with the initials J.W.C. and fragments of luggage that matched descriptions provided by the Charleston police. When authorities arrived to investigate the scene, they found additional evidence that suggested the items had been deliberately scattered rather than lost accidentally. The purse had been emptied of money and jewelry, but personal papers remained inside. The pocket watch had been damaged as if struck with a heavy object. Most significantly, the luggage fragments showed signs of having been burned, with only the metal hardware and corner reinforcements surviving the fire. The scattered pattern of the items suggested they had been thrown into the ravine from the ridge above, requiring someone to carry them a considerable distance from any established trail. County Sheriff Elias Buckworth, who had served in the position for 12 years, recognized that the discovery warranted a formal investigation into the Whitmores' disappearance. However, approaching Cordelia Ashworth presented certain challenges. She had lived in the county for over 30 years and was considered an established resident with no history of trouble with the law. Additionally, her isolated property meant that any investigation would require significant resources and careful planning, particularly as winter weather would soon make the location inaccessible. Rather than conducting an immediate confrontation, Sheriff Buckworth decided to gather additional information through surveillance and interviews with area residents. He assigned Deputy Cornelius Maddox to discreetly observe the Ashworth property and document any unusual activities. Maddox, familiar with the terrain from childhood hunting trips, was able to establish observation posts that provided clear views of the house and surrounding areas without being detected by the occupant. Over a period of 3 weeks in November 1950, Deputy Maddox compiled a detailed record of activities at the Ashworth property. His observations, preserved in case files that were discovered in 1964, reveal a pattern of behavior that strongly suggested Cordelia was not living alone, despite her claims to the contrary. Maddox documented regular movement of multiple figures within the house, evidenced by shadows passing behind different windows at times, when Cordelia was observed working outside. Most significantly, Maddox observed what appeared to be 3 distinct individuals moving about the property during evening hours, when lamplight made their silhouettes visible. One figure matched Cordelia's height and movement patterns, but 2 others appeared to be a man and a woman of younger ages. These figures were observed mainly in the upstairs areas of the house and seemed to follow regular routines, appearing at the same windows at approximately the same times each evening. Maddox also documented unusual patterns in the smoke coming from the house's chimney. During daylight hours, the smoke appeared normal, indicating typical cooking and heating activities. However, during the early morning hours between 2 and 4 o'clock, the smoke would often become much darker and would be accompanied by odors that Maddox described as resembling burning cloth and leather. These burning episodes occurred approximately twice weekly and would last for 30 to 45 minutes before returning to normal wood smoke. On November 18, 1950, Maddox witnessed an event that convinced Sheriff Buckworth to proceed with a formal investigation. During his routine evening observation, Maddox saw 2 figures working in the area behind the house where Cordelia maintained her garden. They appeared to be digging, though the ground would have been partially frozen at that time of year, making such work unusually difficult. The digging continued for approximately 2 hours, after which the figures carried what appeared to be a heavy bundle from the house and placed it in the excavated area before covering it with soil. The following morning, when Maddox returned to his observation post, he found that the disturbed earth had been carefully camouflaged with leaves and brush, but the outline of a rectangular excavation remained visible. More importantly, he observed Cordelia working alone in the garden area, showing no signs of the physical exertion that would have been required for the digging he had witnessed the night before. This discrepancy convinced him that additional individuals were indeed present at the property and were participating in activities that Cordelia was attempting to conceal. Armed with Maddox's observations and the evidence found in the ravine, Sheriff Buckworth obtained a warrant to search the Ashworth property. The warrant was executed on November 23, 1950, when Cordelia was expected to be making her regular trip to Madison for supplies. However, when the sheriff's party arrived at the house, they found Cordelia at home and apparently expecting their visit. She greeted them calmly and invited them to conduct their search, expressing confidence that they would find nothing improper. The initial search of the main floor revealed little of interest beyond the typical possessions of a woman living alone in rural circumstances. The kitchen was well stocked with food supplies, and the parlor contained furniture and personal items consistent with a household that had been occupied for many years. However, when the officers attempted to access the upstairs bedroom, they found that the door had been secured with a substantial lock that Cordelia claimed to have installed for storage purposes. When Sheriff Buckworth demanded access to the locked room, Cordelia initially insisted that she had lost the key during the winter months. However, under pressure from the officers, she eventually produced a large iron key from a pocket in her dress. As she unlocked the door, She explained that the room contained painful memories of boarders who had caused her considerable trouble, and she preferred to keep it sealed to avoid disturbing recollections. The upstairs bedroom, when finally accessed, presented a scene that none of the officers had anticipated. The room appeared to be occupied, with personal belongings arranged as if the inhabitants had stepped out temporarily. Men's clothing hung in the wardrobe, women's garments were folded in the dresser drawers, and toiletries were arranged on the washstand. The bed showed clear evidence of recent use, with rumpled sheets and pillows bearing the indentations of regular occupants. Most disturbing was the condition of the windows. The heavy shutters that Mordecai Finch had observed from the outside were indeed secured with iron latches, but the latches could only be operated from the exterior of the house. From inside the room, the shutters could not be opened, effectively creating a prison for anyone confined within. Scratch marks around the window frame suggested that sustained attempts had been made to force the shutters open from the inside. When Sheriff Buckworth questioned Cordelia about the room's condition, she initially maintained that everything belonged to the Whitmores, and that she had simply never removed their possessions after their departure. However, when pressed about the window latches, she became agitated and began to contradict her earlier statements. She claimed that the Whitmores had requested the special security measures because they carried valuable items and feared theft, but she could not explain why such measures would prevent occupants from exiting the room. Further examination of the bedroom revealed evidence that strongly suggested the room had been occupied much more recently than November of 1948. Food scraps found under the bed were not yet completely decayed, indicating they had been hidden there within the past several months. More significantly, a small notebook hidden beneath the mattress contained diary entries written in a woman's handwriting and dated throughout 1949 and into 1950. The diary entries, written in what appeared to be Imogene Whitmore's hand, based on comparison with samples from Charleston, documented a prolonged period of captivity in the upstairs room. The entries began in November of 1948 and continued sporadically through the winter and spring months, describing a situation of increasing desperation and declining health. The final entry, dated October 10, 1950, consisted of only a few lines. She says it will be over soon. She has decided what must be done. Jasper grows weaker each day. I pray someone will find this and know what happened here. Confronted with this evidence, Cordelia's composure finally collapsed. She admitted that the Whitmores had never left her property, but insisted that their continued presence had been their own choice. She explained that during their first weeks as boarders, she had discovered that they were not actually married and were fleeing Charleston to escape prosecution for theft from Jasper's employer. She had offered to provide them refuge in exchange for their assistance with property maintenance and household chores. According to Cordelia's account, the arrangement had functioned successfully until the couple attempted to leave without paying their accumulated debt for room and board. When she refused to allow their departure, they had threatened to report her to authorities for harboring fugitives. In response, she had secured them in the upstairs room until they could reach a more reasonable agreement about their obligations. She maintained that she had provided them with regular meals and adequate comfort, and that any deterioration in their condition resulted from their stubborn refusal to cooperate with perfectly reasonable expectations. Sheriff Buckworth's investigation team conducted a thorough search of the property while Cordelia was taken into custody for questioning. In the basement of the house, they discovered a workshop area where someone had been engaged in systematic destruction of personal items. Partially burned clothing, melted jewelry, and fragments of luggage confirmed that efforts had been made to dispose of evidence connecting the Whitmores to the property. More disturbing was the discovery of restraint devices, including leg shackles and rope that showed evidence of having been used to secure human beings. The excavated area behind the house, which Deputy Maddox had observed being prepared, yielded the most definitive evidence of what had occurred at the Ashworth property. Buried in the carefully prepared grave, investigators found the remains of two individuals whose physical characteristics matched descriptions of Jasper and Imogene Whitmore. The condition of the remains indicated that death had occurred within the previous month, suggesting that the couple had survived their captivity for nearly 2 years before finally succumbing to the conditions of their imprisonment. Medical examination of the remains revealed evidence of prolonged malnutrition and untreated injuries, consistent with extended physical restraint. Both individuals showed signs of having suffered broken bones that had healed improperly, indicating that they had received injuries during their captivity, but had been denied proper medical treatment. The cause of death could not be definitively determined due to the condition of the remains, but the medical examiner concluded that the victims had likely died from complications resulting from their prolonged mistreatment. Cordelia Ashworth was formally charged with 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of murder in December of 1950. However, the legal proceedings that followed would prove to be as unusual as the circumstances of the crimes themselves. During her initial court appearances, Cordelia presented herself as a confused elderly woman who had become overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. She maintained that she had never intended to harm her boarders and had simply been trying to protect herself from people she believed were dangerous criminals. Her defense strategy centered on claims that the Whitmores had indeed been fugitives from justice and that her actions had been motivated by fear for her own safety. She produced letters that she claimed to have received from Charleston authorities warning her about harboring wanted criminals, though these letters were later determined to be forgeries created by Cordelia herself. She also insisted that she had attempted to release the couple on multiple occasions, but they had chosen to remain because they feared arrest if they returned to Charleston. The trial began in March of 1951 and attracted considerable attention from regional newspapers, though coverage was limited by the remote location and the disturbing nature of the evidence. Cordelia's behavior during the proceedings alternated between confused helplessness and sharp-witted defensiveness, leading some observers to question whether she was mentally competent to stand trial. Her advanced age and apparent frailty also generated sympathy among some community members who found it difficult to believe that she could have physically restrained 2 healthy adults for nearly 2 years. However, testimony from the investigating officers and medical experts painted a clear picture of systematic abuse and deliberate imprisonment. Deputy Maddox's surveillance records documented ongoing activity at the property that contradicted Cordelia's claims about when the victims had died. The diary entries found in the bedroom provided first-hand accounts of the victims' experiences that directly refuted Cordelia's version of events. Most damaging was evidence showing that Cordelia had made detailed preparations for the victims' deaths, including the advanced construction of their grave and the acquisition of materials for disposing of their personal effects. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. However, due to Cordelia's age and the lack of clear premeditation in the original kidnapping, she was sentenced to life imprisonment rather than execution. She was transferred to the Women's Correctional Facility in Alderson, where she was expected to spend her remaining years in relative obscurity. The Ashworth property was sealed by court order pending resolution of estate matters, as Cordelia had no known relatives and had left no will directing the disposition of her assets. The house and surrounding land reverted to county ownership after all legal appeals were exhausted. Local authorities decided that the buildings should be demolished due to their association with the crimes, but harsh winter weather prevented immediate action, and the structures remained standing through the spring of 1952. During this period, several residents of Ashworth Gap reported unusual occurrences at the abandoned property. Night travelers along the hollow road claimed to see lamplight in the windows of the house, despite the fact that electricity had been disconnected and no one had legal access to the buildings. Some attributed these sightings to reflections of moonlight or automobile headlights, but the consistency of the reports suggested that someone was entering the property after dark. In May of 1952, Ambrose Pemberton investigated these reports by visiting the property during daylight hours. He found evidence that the house had indeed been entered despite official seals on the doors. Someone had been using the kitchen, as evidenced by recently used dishes and food scraps. More disturbing was the discovery that the upstairs bedroom had been restored to the condition it had maintained during the Whitmores' captivity, with the bed made and personal items arranged as if awaiting the return of occupants. Sheriff Buckworth ordered increased surveillance of the property and eventually caught the intruder in July of 1952. The trespasser proved to be Cordelia's elderly cousin, Hephzibah Ashworth, who had traveled from Kentucky upon learning of Cordelia's imprisonment. Hephzibah claimed that she was maintaining the property on behalf of the family and insisted that Cordelia had been wrongly convicted based on misunderstanding and incomplete evidence. According to Hephzibah, Cordelia had written to her from prison explaining that the real circumstances of the Whitmores' deaths had been misrepresented during the trial. Cordelia claimed that the couple had actually died as a result of a disease they had contracted before arriving at her property, and that she had concealed their deaths only because she feared being blamed for failing to provide adequate medical care. Hephzibah had come to gather evidence that she believed would support an appeal of Cordelia's conviction. However, Hephzibah's own behavior raised questions about her mental stability and her motives for maintaining the crime scene. She had not only preserved the upstairs bedroom in its exact condition during the investigation, but had also created detailed records of the victim's daily routines based on information she claimed to have received from Cordelia. She had set up a schedule for cleaning and maintaining the room as if she expected the Whitmores to return, and had been purchasing food and supplies to stock the kitchen for their anticipated arrival. When questioned by authorities, Hephzibah revealed that she and Cordelia had maintained extensive correspondence over the years, and that Cordelia had confided details about her boarders long before their deaths became public knowledge. According to Hephzibah, Cordelia had described the Whitmores as ideal tenants who had specifically requested the isolated location and the secure accommodations that Cordelia had provided. She claimed that Cordelia had been heartbroken when the couple finally succumbed to their illnesses and had concealed their deaths only to preserve their dignity and prevent scandal. These revelations prompted a review of Cordelia's case, though the review ultimately supported the original conviction. Investigation of the correspondence between Cordelia and Hephzibah revealed that Cordelia had been documenting her crimes in considerable detail, apparently believing that her cousin would approve of her actions. The letters described the process of securing the victims in the upstairs room and the gradual deterioration of their condition with a detachment that suggested Cordelia viewed their suffering as a natural consequence of their own poor decisions. More disturbing was evidence that Cordelia had planned to expand her boarding house operation and had actively sought additional victims. She had placed advertisements in newspapers throughout the region, seeking young couples interested in quiet mountain retreats, and had conducted correspondence with several potential clients before her arrest. Her letters to Hephzibah included detailed discussions of how she might improve her methods for controlling future boarders, suggesting that she viewed the Whitmores' deaths as learning experiences rather than tragedies. Hephzibah Ashworth was charged with tampering with evidence and interfering with a criminal investigation, but was found incompetent to stand trial due to advanced age and apparent mental deterioration. She was committed to a state mental health facility, where she continued to insist that Cordelia had been wrongly convicted and that the Whitmores would eventually return to claim their belongings. She remained institutionalized until her death in 1955, reportedly still maintaining the delusion that she was preserving the upstairs bedroom for the couple's return. The Ashworth property was finally demolished in September of 1952, with all materials burned on site to prevent any possibility of the buildings being preserved as morbid curiosities. However, the foundation and the basement structure were left intact due to the expense of complete removal. Over the following years, the basement gradually filled with debris and vegetation, though local residents continued to report unusual occurrences in the area. Cordelia Ashworth died in prison in January of 1956 at the age of 66. Prison records indicate that she had maintained her innocence until the end, insisting that she had been victimized by ungrateful boarders who had refused to honor their obligations. She had continued to write letters seeking legal assistance for an appeal, and had maintained correspondence with individuals who she claimed were planning to visit her isolated property once her legal troubles were resolved. In 1964, the case gained renewed attention when Dr. Ambrose Thatcher, a professor of criminal psychology at West Virginia University, selected it as the subject of a comprehensive study on isolated criminal behavior. Dr. Thatcher's research involved extensive interviews with surviving witnesses and a thorough review of all available documentation. His findings, published in a limited academic journal in 1968, provided new insights into the psychological factors that had motivated Cordelia's actions. According to Dr. Thatcher's analysis, Cordelia had likely suffered from a combination of social isolation, economic desperation, and progressive mental deterioration that had created the perfect conditions for her crimes. Her husband's death had left her without adequate financial resources or social support systems, making the prospect of rental income from boarders particularly attractive. However, her lack of experience with hosting strangers, combined with her natural suspicion of outsiders, had created a dynamic where she viewed her tenants as potential threats rather than guests. Dr. Thatcher theorized that Cordelia's decision to imprison the Whitmores had originated from a relatively minor dispute, possibly over payment or house rules, that had escalated due to her inability to resolve conflicts through normal social mechanisms. Once she had committed to restraining them, her isolation prevented any outside intervention that might have ended the situation peacefully. The gradual deterioration of the victim's condition had likely convinced Cordelia that releasing them would result in her own prosecution, creating a cycle where continued imprisonment became her only option for avoiding consequences. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Thatcher's study suggested that Cordelia had not initially intended to harm her boarders, but had been driven to increasingly extreme measures by her fear of exposure and punishment. Her elaborate efforts to maintain the appearance that the couple had departed voluntarily indicated sophisticated planning abilities, but her eventual capture suggested that her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer maintain consistent deception. Dr. Thatcher's research also revealed that Cordelia's case was not entirely unique in the rural Appalachian region during that time period. Economic hardship and social isolation had created conditions where similar crimes occurred with some frequency, though most were less thoroughly documented than the Ashworth case. His study identified several other instances where boarding house operators had exploited or harmed their tenants, though none had involved such prolonged captivity or systematic abuse. The academic attention drawn to the case resulted in additional investigation into the physical evidence that had been preserved from the original trial. In 1967, improved forensic techniques were applied to items found at the crime scene, including the diary entries and personal effects discovered in the upstairs bedroom. This analysis confirmed that the diary had indeed been written by Imogene Whitmore over an extended period, and that the deterioration in her handwriting reflected progressive physical and mental decline consistent with prolonged malnutrition and stress. More significantly, the forensic review identified additional evidence that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Analysis of wood samples from the upstairs bedroom revealed that the window frames had been modified multiple times, suggesting that Cordelia had gradually improved her methods for securing the room as she gained experience with managing captive occupants. The pattern of modifications indicated that the original restraint measures had been relatively simple, but had been repeatedly enhanced to prevent escape attempts. Chemical analysis of fabric samples found in the basement revealed traces of substances that suggested Cordelia had experimented with various methods of sedation or incapacitation. While the concentrations were too degraded to identify specific compounds, the presence of unusual chemical residues indicated that she had been purchasing or obtaining materials not typically found in rural households of that era. This evidence supported theories that she had actively researched methods for controlling unwilling occupants rather than simply improvising solutions as circumstances demanded. The 1967 forensic review also identified previously unnoticed damage to the basement walls that suggested the space had been used for purposes beyond simple storage. Gouges in the stone foundation appeared to be tool marks from excavation work, indicating that Cordelia had modified the basement structure during the period of the Whitmore's captivity. The pattern of excavation suggested that she had been preparing additional confinement areas, possibly in anticipation of acquiring more boarders or as improved facilities for existing captives. These discoveries prompted a final search of the property in 1968 using metal detection equipment to identify any additional burial sites or hidden evidence. The search revealed several small metal objects buried at various locations around the former house site, including jewelry and personal items that appeared to belong to individuals other than the known victims. However, no additional human remains were discovered, and investigators concluded that these items had likely been discarded during Cordelia's disposal of evidence related to the Whitmore's possessions. The case was officially closed in 1969 when all available evidence had been thoroughly analyzed and no additional leads remained to pursue. Dr. Thatcher's study was published in its final form that same year, providing a comprehensive analysis of the psychological and social factors that had contributed to the crimes. His work became a standard reference for criminal psychology students and contributed to improved understanding of isolated criminal behavior in rural environments. Today, the site of the Ashworth property remains vacant, with only the deteriorating foundation stones marking the location where one of West Virginia's most disturbing crimes took place. The narrow hollow road has been abandoned since the 1970s, when the last remaining residents moved away, and the area has gradually returned to wilderness. Occasional hikers report finding fragments of household items scattered in the undergrowth, remnants of a life that ended in isolation and tragedy more than 70 years ago. The fate of Jasper and Imogene Whitmore serves as a reminder of the vulnerability faced by travelers in remote areas during an era when communication was limited and law enforcement resources were stretched thin across vast rural territories. Their story also illustrates the devastating consequences that could result from the combination of economic desperation, social isolation, and untreated mental illness in communities where such problems often remained hidden until they erupted in violence. The hollow where Cordelia Ashworth once maintained her boarding house has been reclaimed by the forest. But the memory of what occurred there continues to influence local folklore and serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind facades of rural hospitality. The case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of prolonged captivity and abuse in Appalachian criminal history, providing insights into the darker aspects of mountain culture that most residents prefer to forget. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that Cordelia's crimes might never have been discovered if not for the accidental finding of evidence in a distant ravine 2 years after the victim's disappearance. The isolation that made her property attractive to travelers seeking privacy also provided the perfect cover for activities that violated every norm of human decency. In a region where self-reliance was valued above outside intervention, the screams from an upstairs window could echo unheard across empty valleys for months or years. The Whitmore case serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most harmless, and that the most secure refuges can become the most inescapable prisons when trust is misplaced. In the end, the couple's search for peace in the mountains led them not to sanctuary, but to a shuttered room where their cries for help went unheard until it was far too late.